Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the League of Women Voters and our last but most important session, a Lunch and Learn series of our legislative week. As you all know, we have had these virtual sessions on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and on Thursday we were in strong force, not necessarily in full force, at the Capitol, hosting our in-person legislative day. And I am so delighted you're all here to join us at this event. Just a quick test, Gittel, if you could just do a thumbs up that you can see the slides and you can hear me clearly. Thank you. Okay. Welcome. My name is Penny Sharan. I am the League of Women Voters Arizona President-elect and State Advocacy Chair. It gives me inordinate pleasure to invite all of you to join in today's conversation and to be part of this very, very important discussion on mobilizing to defend democracy. Today's event is brought to you by the League of Women Voters Arizona State Advocacy Committee. Joining me on this call, in addition to our presenters, is the Vice Chair, Gittel Sear, who is monitoring the chat questions and so on in the background. So we're delighted and very, very grateful for her help and her joint leadership in making many of these events and our advocacy effective in the legislature and through many of the governing bodies. In order to get the best out of today's event, what I'd like to encourage you to do is we mute your microphone, use the Q&A tool to ask your questions. Do not put your questions in the chat. It's easier for us to manage it in the Q&A. Time permitting, the moderators will present questions to the speakers. Any unanswered questions that you put in Q&A, we'll do our very best to get an answer to you, okay? We'll put in the chat how you can contact us. Gittel, when you get a moment, if you could do that. Today's session is being recorded and we will make it available on YouTube, which you can locate on League of Women Voter Arizona YouTube account. Before I introduce the Secretary of State, I'd like to say just a couple of words about the League and our advocacy work. The League of Women Voters will be celebrating its 102nd birthday on Monday. So we ask you all to join us in our work and to continue to join with us to support the work, hopefully into the next 100 years for our daughters, our sons, and our grandchildren. We also want to share with you that the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, all volunteer organization. We neither support nor oppose any candidates, but we stand firm in our positions and we are political and will advocate either for or against legislation or policies that are impacted based on the positions we hold. With that said, it gives me so much pleasure to introduce our Secretary of State, the very, very honorable Katie Hobbs. All of us know Katie. Katie is becoming a superstar on many of the news, not for the reasons we want you to be a superstar, but that's what it is today for us. And that's what we're facing in Arizona. If you did not know, and I shared this, Secretary Hobbs, because we have about 150 new members in the League, many of them actively attending these sessions, and many of them new to Arizona. So this introduction is important about you, not just as a Secretary of State, but your long work that you have done in the social work arena. Secretary Hobbs is a professional and continues to work in the social work arena. And she's been in this space since 1992. She worked as the Chief Compliance Officer at one of the largest domestic violence centers in the US. She was in the House of Representatives, and she was also our Senate Minority Leader. She has been named League of Cities and Towns Legislative Champion. She brings to this work a bachelor's in social work from Northern Arizona and a master of social work at Arizona State University. Secretary Hobbs, we'd love to hear from you as to the state of play and where are we at and what should we do to mobilize to defend democracy.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm always thrilled to spend time with the League of Women Voters. And just before I start, just want to say how important your work is. My office absolutely sees your organization as a partner in making sure that we are giving voters, equipping voters with the tools and information they need to participate in our democracy. And that work right now is more important than ever as we are facing continued onslaught of misinformation about our elections designed to undermine voters' confidence in our election systems. And so we have to continue to stay focused on equipping voters with the right information about how to participate. And for those of you who participated in the committee yesterday, I'm sure you are well aware of the onslaught of very damaging election bills that we're facing as we head into the 2022 election. And I think we should be braced for a level of confusion related to how our elections are going to be affected by all of this legislation, depending on when it's enacted and when the general effective date is, and if it goes into effect before or after the primary. We're seeing bills that are designed to just make it harder for election administration and harder for voters to vote and participate. And so your work is so critical, as our work together as we work to inform voters how to continue to participate. So thank you so much for all of that, not just your work on informing voters, but also your advocacy, advocating for common sense election bills that make voting easier. So I just want to share a little bit really briefly with all of you about what we're doing heading into the 2022 election to make sure we're continuing to have elections that are fair and secure, and just making sure that voters have the tools they need. First and foremost, with regards to registration, we're embarking on a series of town halls, making sure that we're informing people how to register to vote. That obviously the first step in voter participation. I'm sure you all know this very well, but voters in Arizona can vote online at servicearizona.com if they've got an Arizona driver's license or non-operating ID card issued by the Division of Motor Vehicles. You can register to vote by mail by either printing off a form online or requesting a form from your county recorder. And finally, you can vote in or register to vote in person by visiting your county recorder's office and filling out a form in person. We are continuing to remind voters to update voter registration if they have moved to a new address, legally changed their name, or would like to change their political party affiliation. And our office continues to provide information through arizona.vote. And so anyone who is looking for tools to check their voter registration status, update their voter registration, or register can go to arizona.vote. So we are continuing to, as we head into the 2022 election, continuing to eat, sleep, and breathe election security. Our commitment to building a culture of security has permeated every aspect of our election process. And so we are constantly focused on this by collaborating with the local election providers, all 15 county recorders and elections directors. And we host monthly security meetings with all 15 counties, sharing resources, information, and best practices. We're also continuing to be in regular collaboration with the Department of Homeland Security, working with them to offer election security services to all counties in the state, have close relationships with FBI, the Department of Emergency Management, and the Arizona Counterterrorism Information Center, all focused on election security. In 2019, our office conducted the first ever statewide election security workshop, training, and tabletop exercise. It was very successful, and we're currently planning one for this year. Right now it's scheduled for April. So these are simulated, the tabletop exercises is a simulated exercise fraught with disasters that election officials have to work together to respond to in preparation for things that could actually happen in the election. In 2020, we oversaw elections during the pandemic, and the amendment upfront wouldn't have to choose freedom to vote or health and safety. Despite all of the obstacles we face, we were successful. In 2020, our election had historic participation, where we saw in the number of registered voters across all parties statewide. And as we are heading into 2022, obviously we're already in 2022, not necessarily knowing the environment we're going to be in terms of the pandemic, but we had to conduct an election safely amidst these health challenges, continued health challenges. And so I think we're going to be ready when it comes to that. In 2020, our goal to ensure that our election was both secure and accessible was achieved, despite many claims to the contrary, and we will do that again in 2022. Our priorities include providing the resources needed to allow eligible voters to participate. We're also continuing with our unique URL program, which we launched in 2020 to make it more efficient for third-party groups to register voters. Past participants in this program included the Center for Disability Law, the Phoenix Indian Center, Rock the Vote, One Arizona, and the Arizona Students Association. We're also continuing our work with the state's Voter Outreach Advisory Council, helping us to amplify and increase voter education and outreach efforts to ensure that voters are more engaged and informed. Also continuing the partnerships that were critical in the successful execution of 3 elections in 2020. So I think that, you know, the biggest challenges we had into this election really is the continued onslaught of misinformation that we're all having to deal with. Again, continued to undermine the trust in each other and our democratic processes. And everyone plays such a critical role in helping respond to this, making sure that we're sharing accurate information, that we're sharing news articles from reputable sources, encouraging our family and friends to do the same, and encouraging everyone to get their information from verified websites and election officials. You know, as we see this continued avalanche of really terrible legislation that's designed to make it harder for people to vote, that's all based on the misinformation, conspiracy theories coming out of the 2020 election. This sharing accurate information is more important than ever. And I think one of the most important things we could do to ensure that voters are able to participate in our elections. I will leave it there, and thank you so much for having me.
Secretary Hobbs, I hope you can hang on. We'd really like you to stay to answer questions. You know, this is an area of such not just anxiety. We feel distressed, and we feel really fearful as to what's going to be happening in 2022 into 2024. So I'd like to take a moment, if you don't mind, to bring Alex and Joel into this conversation and then open up, because it might frame the questions a lot more robustly when they have a little bit more information. You have shared wonderfully what you are doing, you know, to reassure all of us as the work that needs to be done. So I'd like to call on our next, one of our panelists, and I would like very much to introduce to you all Alex Galota. Alex, I always mutilate your last name, so you must forgive me for the millionth time for doing that. So I want to introduce Alex this way. You can see all his accomplishments on the screen. Alex is part of the leadership conference And what our league members need to know is they are in very close connection and partnership with LWVUS. LWVUS has a very special relationship with the Leadership Conference. Now, having said that, what I'd also like all our members to be aware of is that Alex has been an incredible friend and ally for the league. And I have never known him to say no to any request that I have made to come and speak to the league. Alex, the league is indeed honored to be your ally and link arms with you on this fight that we have all embarked on to save democracy. Now, to tell you some of the facts, right? Arizona State Director of All Voting is Local, which is part of the Leadership Conference. Since 2018, he's been fighting for the freedom to vote through a unique combination of community power building, data-driven advocacy, and strategic communications. And I've seen all of them be really impactful. He previously served the Access to Justice community for 33 years as an anti-poverty lawyer, 24 years as a nonprofit executive director and consultant to Access to Justice organizations, and a graduate of Marquette University and Marquette University School of Law. So Alex, thank you so much. You're on the spotlight. Shall I drive to your slide, or can I introduce Joel and then take you both through the slides? Okay. All right. So very good. So let me now introduce another really, really dear friend of the league, and that is Joel Edmund. Many of us know Joel with his incredible work under an organization, Arizona Advocacy Network. We are so delighted you have not left the space, but built an even more powerful space as the co-executive director of the Arizona Democracy Resource Center. The league is really honored to be working with you, Joel, and I, am very honored to be in this battle with you and to engage to make sure we are fighting for democracy. Joel has been, and this is the part of Joel's story that I love. He's been engaged in Arizona politics since high school. So I think he is not, it's in his DNA. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School. He is a ASU Flynn Scholar. And if you are new to Arizona, this is a very prestigious scholarship in Arizona given to deserving high school students, and has an undergraduate in political science and history. He was a law clerk to Chief Justice Scott Bales in the Arizona Supreme Court, law clerk to Judge Rosalind O. Silver of the U.S. District Court of Arizona, and he was previously the executive director of the Arizona Advocacy Network. I'm going to jump into the discussion that Alex is going to lead first, and so we'll bring Alex on. And Alex, I shall drive the slide train, so you just let me know.
All right, pleasure to be here. Why don't we start on slide 9? Penny, can we do that?
Yes, we can. Of course it would be. Is that where you want me to start?
Yeah, does that work?
Alex, you are truly testing me today, right? Okay, give me just a second to get it to 9.
Or you can just click through them and then we'll get to
Okay, there you go. That's 9.
Anyway, what I'll say is while we're teeing up the slides, I think like Secretary Hobbs is absolutely right that we're in a fight, and unfortunately there is a small faction of people. They're well funded, they're very noisy, but they're people who believe in authoritarianism over freedom, people who believe in conspiracy theories and lies over facts and data, people who believe in political power and greed over fairness and justice, right? It's that basic. And they're targeting communities, particularly communities of color that have had increased access to the political process, increased access to voting, and they're doing it in 2 ways. They're making it harder to vote, and even more troubling, they're trying to undermine the results of the elections, right? And that's like the 2 strategies that they've been engaging in. And they continue to engage in. And we're just going to give some examples and then talk about what you can do. Next, please, Penny. Actually, yeah. So three different ways impeding election administration. One is criminalizing election officials. If you click, Penny, that little, yeah, thanks. So, you know, making felonies out of all kinds of different things that election officials could engage in, right? And so in the abstract, it's like, well, why is this bad? Well, it's bad because we're attacking our election officials, not on any basis, but based on falsehoods and conspiracies that they're doing something wrong. We're attacking them because we don't like the results of the election, not because of, in fact, how they're doing their jobs. Next, please, Penny. Damaging election administration. In Arizona, I think there was more than $11 million in foundation funding that came into Arizona to help do voter education, help set up drop boxes, help counties pay for overtime so people could go collect ballots from drop boxes, all kinds of things that these private grants were used, and we made that money illegal. We made it illegal to get grants to help with election administration and election education. Horrible policy. Restricting the power of the Secretary of State. There was an attempt last session that made it into the budget bill and was struck down because the budget was struck down to basically limit the power of the Secretary of State, our chief elections official, and it was completely partisan, and it was, you know, set to expire in 2023. And you know, happily, that was struck down when the budget was struck down, but it's that kind of thing that we're seeing. Next, please, Penny. You might have to click it twice. Struck down, good. Voter purges, both from the early voting list, and if you click there, SB 1485, removing voters for basically because they haven't voted their mail-in ballot. And there's kind of a trick there that not everyone realizes yet. This is a new law that's going to get implemented unless we get it repealed beforehand. But under this law, if you don't use your mail-in ballot to cast that ballot once within a 2-year cycle, then you're going to get kicked off, even if you've been voting regularly in person, right? So you have to actually use your in-person ballot, or we're going to take it away from people. Really bad policy. It's the law now, like I say, unless we get it repealed.
Alex, if I might interrupt for just a second, because it would be timely if you could spend a few more minutes on what do we mean by use the ballot, if you could clarify that. Number of questions on that front, please.
You basically have to actually cast that ballot. You have to bring your mail-in ballot. You either have to mail it back or you have to drop it off at a polling place and have it be tabulated, because that's the way the law was written.
So Alex, a follow-up question. So if I walked into a ballot and I had received a mail ballot and chose to actually do a standard ballot at the polling location, then I would be someone who did not use my mail ballot, correct?
Correct.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yes, it's a trick, it's a trap. And then remove people from the official rolls. There was a provision that was put in the budget that would allow a private company to flag people to be removed and to tell our election officials, to tell the Secretary of State and our election and our local election officials who to remove from the rolls. Cyber ninjas telling our state election officials who should be removed from the rolls. This was also struck down in the budget, but as Joel will speak to, it's back. Next, please, Penny. Yeah, you probably have to click again. All right, I'll go through these quickly. Making it harder to vote by mail. Voter ID laws require, again, did not pass last time, back again. Some provision to require more ID with your mail-in ballot. Next, please, Penny. Basically, statutory provisions that would require that your mail-in ballot be returned in person. Again, did not pass last session. They're back again. Next, please, Penny. Eliminates mail-in voting, repeals the early voting list, completely does away with mail. So that was last session. This session, and Joel will speak to those. There are a host of them that, if you will, put us back to 1958 style voting, and I think they mean that in both ways. And then overturning the election results, attempts to allow the state legislature to basically decertify the results. Next, please, Penny. Changing the certification procedures, or as Joel will talk about, basically having the legislature have the ability to set aside the election if they don't like the results. Next, please, Penny. There's also what came out of our sham election review at the Coliseum. Next, please. And just a few things about this, just because I think it's part of what we want to focus on, and that is that this sham election review and many of these bills that we're seeing are ways for losing campaigns to continue to move their campaigns forward. They're ways for losing campaigns to not finally admit that they lost and continue to raise money. Next, please. It's a concerted national effort. It started in Arizona, but it's happening in a number of states now. Next slide, Penny. It was difficult to determine what was happening when this first started in Arizona and before we knew what was happening. But as a result of public records requests, advocacy organizations, investigative journalism, a lot of information was uncovered that made it clear that this was clearly partisan actions of a losing campaign continuing to try and campaign. The purpose of these reviews has been to undermine historic turnout in communities of color. Next, please. These sham election reviews are not unrelated to election integrity units. We got one in Arizona before this last election. They're considering them in a number of other states now. It's to use governmental power to try and intimidate voters and thwart participation. Next, please. And community education is really essential. We need to be able to mobilize people and help people understand what is happening to stop these bills from becoming law and to stop people from actually being able to undermine our democratic system. Joel.
Thanks, Alex. I am going to carry this forward into what is happening so far in the 2022 legislative session and what we know is moving towards the ballot for 2022. And I'm going to start with sounding pretty similar to some of the main themes that Alex sketched out that we saw last year. They're running the same sort of basic playbook of strategies to restrict voting, in particular restrict voting methods that are used disproportionately by communities of color, by voters with disabilities, and other particularly targeted groups that they would like to disfavor and push out of the electorate as much as possible, as well as attacking our basic election infrastructure, spreading disinformation. So those same strategies that Alex was just talking about that we saw play out last year after the 2020 elections, all still going, and in many cases, I would say, are ramping up. We have something like 100 bills. I don't need to get the final total now that we've passed the introduction deadline, but something like 100 bills that in some way restrict our ability to register to vote, or impose onerous, unnecessary burdens on elections officials with the purpose of making it harder for them to run elections and facilitate voting for all of us. So I want to run through some of these broad categories of bills, like I mentioned, with about 100. Actually, if we could stay on the previous one for just a sec. Thank you, Penny, or whomever is manning our slides. I appreciate you. Like I said, with so many bills, I'm not going to go through every single one, but I do know that this is a really engaged, active audience. So I will touch on a couple in particular. But before that, some of what I am the most worried about, there's a few categories, but in particular, there's a lot of interest around restricting voting by mail. That includes the ability to drop your mail-in ballot at a drop box. That includes adding new identity information to add onto your early ballot, or it won't count. That includes chipping away further at the early voting list. That includes requiring folks to wait in line in order to drop off your early ballots at election day or at a polling place on election day. And so it's sort of all over the place, attempts to chip away, as we saw last year, at voting by mail, in particular, using additional voter ID in that process in various points to make it simply to erect new barriers, create new reasons why ballots can be thrown out in the counting process. As just about every year, we see more attacks on the citizen initiative process, and I'll touch on more of those in just a second. Again, at the bottom, there are, I have lost count of how many new bills to create a new felony or other kinds of new restrictions on counties, on the Secretary of State in doing their jobs. And we have a real, I think, disturbing trend so far this year in efforts to chill voter registration and efforts by community organizations like the League and like a whole lot of others that we all work with in this democracy defense work by either imposing new registration requirements before you're allowed to go and do voter registration work. That's in a bill called Senate Bill 1629, which will be up in the Government Committee on Monday. I said I would name a couple specific bills. And then a bill called 2170 that also targets voter registration groups, saying that you have to put some disclaimers on your communications if you want to send someone a copy of a voter registration form or a link to register to vote. If the League, for example, wants to put in your newsletter a link to the registration form, you'd also have to note that you are not a government agency, which is a little odd. But in other contexts, we're worried that it will actually discourage voters and make them think that they're not getting accurate information, when in reality they're getting a link to go register to vote. So sort of sowing more distrust around voter registration. And now I'm ready for the next slide. Sorry, I packed a lot into that one. But we do have some things moving towards the ballot that impact our democracy in various ways. Last year, the legislature, as I mentioned, with attacks on initiatives and our ability as the voters to propose and pass our own ideas at the ballot. Those two, the bill numbers are up here. They'll be called something different when they are on the ballot. They'll have a proposition number, but they are both attempts to chip away again at our ability to pass our own laws as the voters. The first one would create a new loophole in something called the Voter Protection Act that we, the people, passed back in 1998. It's what stops the legislature from messing with or undermining our measures once we pass them. This would again create a huge loophole for the legislature to go in and gut anything that a court has altered in some way. So clean elections being one of them, potentially invest in ed and other measures down the road. And then imposing new sort of regulations around what we're allowed to propose via so-called single subject rule. The legislature last year tried to, oh no, I've lost the slide up here. But tried to basically repeal the invest in ed measure that we, the voters, passed in the 2020 elections. That's what this reduction in revenue bit is about. And then I'm proud to quickly touch on an effort that our organization and Alex's are a part of, and that we are very eager to have the League's support behind here very soon. around the Fair Elections campaign. This was a ballot initiative, a proactive democracy reform ballot initiative that we all were moving towards the ballot 2 years ago before the pandemic came to Arizona, and we made the decision at the time to shut down signature collection. Very excited to bring this back. It has 4 major things as are listed in here. Protecting the right to vote would undo many of the attacks that Alex went through from last year and prevent many that we are talking about this year, including restoring the permanent early voter list and safeguarding and making voter registration much more accessible. Guarding against the legislature from overturning our presidential results in 2024 or beyond, and preventing, a legislature, frankly, of any party from deciding that they want to say that the loser actually won, as of course we have seen since 2020. Undoing some of the barriers that the legislature has thrown up to make it harder to do these ballot measures to begin with, as we, the voters, have done things like raise the minimum wage and invest in education. The legislature and the corporate interests that control the legislature every year come back to make it a little bit harder and a little bit more expensive and a little bit riskier and a little bit easier to throw these things off the ballot over technicalities and not give us, the voters, the opportunity to actually weigh in on those things. And then lastly, various policies that are aimed at limiting the influence of money. I saw a question in the Q&A about how we can, forget the exact way it was put, but how do we save clean elections? So this is also our answer to that, because we would bring more funding resources into clean elections and make that a more viable option for candidates to run clean, as well as limiting the influence of private, corporate, and lobbyist money in a variety of ways. So that effort just launched this week, and hopefully we will have petition sheets that we can share with y'all very soon, and hope to have that on the ballot this November. All right, Alex, I think I am kicking it back to you.
Alex, if you could unmute.
Yes, very quickly. Yeah, just very quickly. Next slide, please, Penny, and then we can get to questions. Just Democracy Pledge. Back one. Yeah, democracypledgeaz.com. That's just something a coalition put together that basically are basic principles of democracy we're asking people to uphold. And then the next slide is vote411.org, obviously, which is the League's place for all things voting, and those are resources that are available if you want to take action. Both of those websites have information about things you can do to get involved if you want to get involved, and happy to talk more about that. And I think Joel and I are finished and hope we can take questions at this point.
So I'm going to lead off with a couple of leading questions just to, flesh out some of the points you made. That was a lot for our groups to, take in, and all of us that are in the weeds and can rattle off the bill numbers, we want to be sure the other people can really pay absolute attention to what needs to happen. So Joel or Alex, either you put 2 bills coming up, but even the bills that have been heard, they don't necessarily mean that they're a done deal. So can you highlight a few of the bills, and I'll put it in the chat as you rattle it off, if either of you can remember the names. The one that I would like to urge you to speak about is the ballot boxes, the whole issue around ballot boxes and the paper ballots and the equipment. Just give us a broad sense of that arena, if you will. And Secretary Hobbs, if you could weigh into that too, is how nonsensical some of those issues are and why they are unenforceable, if you will. Okay, Joel, if you want to take it, and then Secretary Hobbs, or Joel or Alex, if you will.
Sure, I'll be quick and then happy to kick it to you, Madam Secretary. 2 quick bill numbers to drop specifically around some of those subjects. Like I mentioned, there's just a lot attacking drop boxes, but one that has made it out of committee in the House and we might see on the floor as soon as next week is House Bill 2238. It says that it bans the use of unmonitored drop boxes, but does not specify what that means at all. I know that the counties, and I imagine working with the Secretary's office, have done quite a lot of work to spell out the procedures by which they use these drop boxes and make sure that they're secure. This bill would put that in danger. And then a House bill called 2241 that's in the same position. It would be ready to go to the House floor as soon as next week. This one says that, right now, if you vote early, and a lot of people will do this, you have your early ballot, but want to go drop it off at the polls on election day. In a typical election in Maricopa County, I think this was in 2020 was the number. Alex, I know we'll have this if I'm wrong. Something like 250,000 voters dropped off their ballot at the polls on election day. Folks like to hold on to them and make sure that they do their research. We've got long ballots in Arizona. Some folks just love the experience of going to the polls, right? Even if you don't want to wait in line to vote there. Well, 2249 would say that now you do have to wait in line just to drop off your ballot. Wait in line and then show your ID. But honestly, this tactic is really not about IDs at all. It's about making people wait in line. They know that, and we have seen around the country, that the longer you can make the lines, that's a real discouragement from voting. So those are a couple more specifics, but like I said, there's a lot to follow. So really trying to focus more sort of on the overarching strategies that they're using to attack. And it's just finding all these different ways to make it a little bit harder to use that early ballot, either by getting rid of the drop box you used last time or making you go stand in line just to drop it off.
Madam Secretary, if you could weigh in on some of these, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just touch on the ballot Dropbox issue. And whenever I say ballot Dropbox, I like to make sure I'm saying secure ballot Dropboxes to make sure that folks know that these aren't just like containers that are randomly put out, but there's specific specifications, sorry, that was redundant, about how they're designed and installed. And for the most part, these are installed at government buildings where there is some level of security around them. But we greatly expanded the number in 2020 to make vote by mail easier, especially in rural communities where vote by mail is not as accessible as it is to us here in Maricopa County. And that was an essential component of the historic turnout and participation that we saw in the 2020 elections. These are boxes that are designed much like a library book return or even a mailbox. Speaking of unmonitored secure ballot drop boxes, we have U.S. Postal Service mailboxes all over the place, and not just at government buildings. And people can drop their ballots into these receptacles all the time. And so it's really hypocritical and really more of an attack on early voting, trying to make it harder to vote early. So that's what I wanted to add to what Joel said. I think there's so much legislation moving right now. What we know is that next week is the last week to hear bills in committee in their chamber of origin. So at the end of next week, we should have a much better sense of what legislation is still moving. But these terrible bills have just been flying through committees. That doesn't mean that they're going to get a hearing on the floor or that they'll sail out of chambers. I think we have yet to see how those dynamics are going to play out, especially some of the rifts that were created through the Sham the Sham ballot review, and what that means for bills getting particularly out of the Senate because of some of the rifts that were caused by that.
Alex and Joel, if you could stay, I'm trying to pull the threads through these conversations sort of to kind of keep it in the same piece, if you will. Alex and Joel, from an activist perspective, can you speak about what can we do to help put an end to them moving from one chamber when it comes to the floor vote? Can you talk a little bit about activism strategies for we know as an organization what we're going to be doing, but for the individuals on the call, what can they do? What should they be doing with a sense of urgency? Because we're only talking about, next week and the week after. So could either of you talk about that, please? Or both of you for that matter.
I'll start. So I think that having a high level view is a better choice this session than trying to get into every bill, because probably whatever bill that finally sneaks through, or they try and finally sneak through, is going to be a striker at the last minute that takes a bunch of pieces of these other bills and crams them into like a new bill, right? And so like focusing on this number or that number is not, in my mind, the best way to approach this session. They're trying to hurt vote by mail in this way and this way and this way. They're trying to make it harder for election officials to conduct the election by putting holograms on paper, by requiring that we have to buy machines that aren't even available on the market, that we can't use machines to tabulate the results, and all of these other things. And there are basically buckets of sort of theoretical buckets, if you will, as to what these bills fall in that hurt our elections. And we don't know exactly which is going to be the one that's going to come up. Almost, in my opinion, none of them are offered in good faith. Almost all of them are based on conspiracy theories and lies. I've heard people say, like, well, we have to do something. And I'm like, what? And why is that we have to do something, right? Like the premise that we have to do something about our elections was created by this false circus of the cyber ninjas and all of this propaganda that we've been subjected to since November of 2022. And I want people to stand up and recognize that for what it is. And it's like, we've been bombarded with propaganda that have been lying about the security of our elections, and we should not let that drive our policy. And I want our leaders to stand up and start saying that more and more and more, again and again and again, louder and louder and louder.
We can always count on passion from Alex, right? So Joel, next, can you add and kind of, it's fine to look at the buckets, but it doesn't remove the anxiety that there are bills that are going to be heard on the floor. And it's fine to say, we've got to approach it from the broad perspective. That helps us get our head wrapped around it, Joel and Alex, but we still have to do some serious grassroots work to these legislators to say, in fact, ask that question, why do we need this bill? Rather than, maybe the question Alex is asking. So can you talk about that, Joel? What is our strategy as individuals to really get our voices heard to stop this assault?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, to build on where Alex started us with, I think it is true that we are, unlike in some past sessions where maybe there were a couple dozen bills attacking the right to vote, and we could quickly figure out which 3 or 4 or 5 were going to be the biggest threats that we could focus on all session. That's not where we're at right now, that there are so many, and we are able to track all of them, but it's hard to say sort of on this specific bill, use these talking points to talk to these specific, particular legislators. But that doesn't mean that there isn't anything that can be done. One is that there is this, as Alex said, there's this sort of desire to do something from a lot of folks in the Republican caucuses at the legislature. And that's because they're hearing a lot from folks who have, bought into these conspiracies, who have been, sort of infected with all this disinformation, and are not hearing as much from folks saying, we need you to protect access to voting, right? We need you to focus on limiting the influence of the folks whose money you're taking right now to spread disinformation, and pushing back in the other direction. So I want to encourage folks to continue to reach out to legislators. It may look a little different than in years past, where it's not vote no on SB, whatever it is every week, but vote no on bills that will restrict access to voting, right? Vote no on bills that are based on a conspiracy theory, right? That would bring back Cyber Ninjas 2.0, because what I just said, those three categories, that covers basically every bill that is being introduced by a member of the majority around elections. Either restricts the ability to vote, is based on some conspiracy theory, or is designed to create another Cyber Ninjas sham, and continue to spread more disinformation. So saying say no to those things and instead focus on protecting our access to being able to vote, protect our elections from partisan interference from the legislature, right? So we can advocate, and I think in some ways it's actually get back to our basics of what are we actually for, right? And what are we actually against? Sometimes when there's a specific bill that is so terrible, it's easy to say, we're against that. That is horrible. But we know the specific bills are going to keep changing as session moves. And so as critical as each of these hearings are, I think the biggest thing we can do in session is clearly articulating what we want and what we don't want. And then outside of just the focus on session, I think is taking the opportunities to move proactively where we can. So I'm sure a lot of folks here over the last year were active in trying to get Congress to pass some new protections on voting rights, safeguarding our elections and funding our election infrastructure. I know our senior senator, as well as the senator from West Virginia, have been blocking that, along with the Republican members of the Senate. And that's been really frustrating for a lot of folks here and around the country. And I know I just briefly touched on the Fair Elections campaign, but that will be an opportunity to move proactively. Educating folks about what is happening and why these things are happening at the state capitol is really, really valuable. So folks, telling people there's 100 bills coming for your right to vote can in some ways actually be disempowering, right? But to say that there's a radical faction that controls the Capitol that is using their power to try to restrict your right to vote because they're afraid of the power that our communities have when we show up. And that is powerful, right? And then that gets into a bigger conversation around what are they afraid of, right? Sort of whose agenda are they serving, if not ours? And that kind of education, I think, is really effective and builds, power in the long run, in a way that, in past years, we were asking folks to, learn the right talking points on all the bills. That's just going to be a confusing mess, I think, this year. But we can get back to, again, what we're for, what we're against.
Can I just add on there too? I think that the sheer volume of bills that we're seeing is part of the strategy. There's so much happening right now that is working to silence voices of opposition at the legislature. Number one, the fact that we're still in the middle of a pandemic and the legislature is not honoring any safe protocols. And so in order to have your voice heard, you have to be down there at the Capitol in the middle of a bunch of anti-vax or anti-max or masked people. And so that's number one. Number two, the system that you can utilize online to weigh in and not have to expose yourself at the Capitol it's not functioning. And it's been incredibly frustrating for people to utilize that system. And then number three, just the volume, as Joel just talked about, there's so much coming at us that is, I think, part of the design to make people feel anxious and overwhelmed, and that there's just no way to oppose all that. And so they just won't. And I think part of that too, just the fact that there's this sheer volume of bills out there is causing confusion already for people who aren't necessarily focused on advocacy against these bills, but just confusion about what this means for the next election. I granted, there's not necessarily a lot of people paying attention right now, but we have heard people saying, well, what does this mean? Does this mean I can't get a ballot by mail anymore? And these things aren't even in law yet. And so there's just that confusion that will right now serve to suppress turnout in the fall, because people just, they don't know what's what. And that's again why the education piece post session is going to be so critical.
Madam Secretary, I want to take what you said about the educating the public, as to really the laws and what actually impacts the voters while all the dust settles. There's a question about the voting machines, will new voting machines, not based on the crazy bills that are coming up, that voting machines have to be have to be able to do things like beam me up, Scotty, and stuff like that. But, I'm just saying, guys. But what about these voting machines? Do they have to replace those because they were compromised in Maricopa County?
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, the issue isn't whether or not they were actually compromised. We'll never know, because when the cyber ninjas took possession of them, there wasn't public access or cameras or anything in the room they were in. The issue is that, and this is based on both guidance from the Federal Election Assistance Commission and the Federal Department of Homeland Security, is the loss of chain of custody by certified election officials. So the second that Maricopa County turned those machines over to the cyber ninjas, that chain of custody was lost. And so for all intents and purposes, based on this guidance, those machines were compromised and not able to be used again. And so Maricopa County already took the action we took the action to notify them if they intended to use this equipment again, we would have to start the process of decertification. They notified us that they weren't going to, and the Board of Supervisors already took a vote to replace the equipment. And I think it's probably, if it hasn't already been replaced, it will be before the next election.
On that matter, what are we anticipating? We don't know what's going to go through, but what should we be ready to educate? We know the bills that passed in 2021. So we know the education we have to do. For example, a very important one, unless we can reverse it, which won't have an impact till after 2022, is, the concept of use of a mail ballot and how that impacts you. I think that's not well understood. And we know as a league, we're going to do a lot of education on that. What else do we need to educate the public about regarding how their voting experience is going to change because of some of these laws? So if all of you could take a cut at that, it would be helpful for everybody, because that's keeping that umbrella view, if you will, rather than, trying to figure each bill out. Secretary Hobbs, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a really critical piece is pointing voters to trusted sources of information. So I mentioned in my remarks the Arizona.vote, that is going to continue to be updated. And I know that as soon as session's over and we know what laws may or may not be in effect that change the voting process for 2022, both the primary and the general, that we're going to have information there. We will work in conjunction with Clean Elections Commission, which is tasked with voter education as well as advocacy groups that are also like the League of Women Voters, Joel and Alex, in terms of getting the information out to the constituencies that we work with. But for, I think, pointing people to election officials' websites to get their voting information is going to be critical.
Joel, on that, do you or Alex see a real progress being made on this one bill, which is really for the league very, very worrisome, is the notion that we have to say, because that's what we do in our Vote 411 platform, which is a national platform. We send people to the Secretary of State, and Secretary Hobbs, the league has a unique URL too, and we've been, trying to send people to that. So do you see that actually moving anywhere? This whole, the one about notarizing, if you collect 25 voter registrations in a whole year, and the other part about having to put that disclaimer saying, this is not a governmental site. Can you speak on that a little bit? Because those are worrisome for us in the league.
I think that pertains probably to paper forms, people collecting paper forms. If you're registering online voters, you're using the Motor Vehicle Service Arizona platform. I don't think they're connected, but maybe a lawyer can correct me. We haven't talked about that as a potential consequence.
Joel,
I mean,
Alex?
I think the bill that's currently, up for consideration, the 1629, that's anyone who collects a form. But most of our groups collect forms. Most of the VR groups, they table and they collect forms. Oftentimes, a lot of our native vote partners and whatnot are collecting forms because there's not good internet access, et cetera. And so, the restrictions on the forms would be bad. I'm hoping that we can beat those back. I think that the disclosure, although it may not be ill-intended, I think it has unintended consequences. The way it's currently written, it applies to, Representative Hoffman said it only applies to things that are mailed, but it's not actually true. It actually applies to any electronic communication, which means every social media post would have to say not from a governmental entity or whatever the phrase is. And so like if every tweet would have to say, if it has a link to the registration, would have to say not from a governmental entity. It's a bad bill. It's not good policy. We're hoping that we can get people to see that and we'll beat it back. From my point of view, Penny, what we can prepare people to do is check your registration. It doesn't matter, check your registration. Even if you've never checked your registration, this is a year everyone should check their registration in July and again in September to make sure that they're still registered. Get your mail ballot early. Vote your mail ballot this time, even though sometimes you don't, so that you actually use your mail ballot and you've got your chit in on the 1485 new requirement. You've used a mail ballot. Vote your mail ballot early. And if for some reason you can't do that, vote early in person as soon as you can so that you get your ballot counted and there's time to react if there's a problem, right? The beauty of early voting and early in-person voting is if you go and there's a problem, there's still time to deal with that problem unless it's just that you're not registered, right? And so I think check your registration, use your mail-in ballot, cast it early, vote early in person if you don't want to vote by mail so that you can preempt any problems before Election Day.
Joel, you want to add anything to that front?
Yeah, and I'll pivot back to some of the questions. I know there's still stuff in the chat around how we can most effectively advocate at the legislature. And I do have one other specific to throw out. And to get there, I have to talk a little bit about partisan politics of the legislature. I realize the league and this conversation is a nonpartisan one. So this is purely descriptive, but it is extremely partisan. The Republicans control both chambers by a 1-vote margin. And so I see questions around, at the Republican Party as a whole, sort of moving towards restricting voting. If that's the case, how can we stop these bills? Well, last year with these same margins, some bad things passed, as Alex went through in the presentation. A lot of terrible things didn't, because you don't need to convince most of the Republican legislators for a bill to die. You need to convince one, assuming all of the Democrats will hold and vote no, as they typically have on all of these bills. So who is the most likely to be sort of movable? This is not really based on any inside intelligence, but we have had redistricting since the last legislative session. And so all the districts have shifted around, and some legislators find themselves newly in more competitive districts. Some legislators who maybe were already in a swing district, it looks even a little swingier. So that's just to say those are most likely to be the folks who can actually be influenced by folks saying we don't want to see anything that restricts our right to vote. And I'm just going to name the new district numbers that appear to be the closest, and let folks do your own homework on go to the redistricting page and see if you are in one of these districts. But districts 2, 4, 9, 13, 16, 17, and 27 are the most competitive districts In the new map, those are the new numbers, so not the old ones. If you're used to the old numbers like I am, go take a look at what the new maps are set for this coming election and beyond, because that's what folks who are running for re-election are going to be thinking about, is those new districts. So if you are in one of them, if there are other league members or other folks you know, family, friends, whatever, you can contact in those districts to be making calls, those are going to go a long way. Because again, we don't have to convince most of the folks in the majority to change their minds about these things. You just have to get one in either chamber, but that of course takes folks hearing from people in their districts.
Alex and Joel, I want to share this observation at yesterday's at our legislative week, our day at the Capitol. We heard from a couple of the senators, and while they did make the point that the small vocal vociferous minority is there with their loud voices, and there aren't enough of voices from our side. So I want to be sure to piggyback on what you're saying. It's not just go, you want to talk to legislators in these districts, but let's not just RTS, start writing to the committee members, let them hear, so they can't say, oh, we're not hearing anything else. And more importantly, the league has made a commitment to testify in person. So we're there, if nothing else, to show support for the legislators who are trying to do the right thing. And we think that's very important too. So I wanted to add that for our members who may not be aware that we are actually testifying in person, and to urge them to move that forward. I want to pivot, if you don't mind, to talk about the umbrella of bills that will have an impact on the power of the Secretary of State to give oversight and to establish democratic norms for elections administration. So, Secretary Hobbs, if you could start with that, and then Alex and Joel, weigh into that a little bit, please.
I'll just say this is a strategy that we've seen around the country. So it's not unique to Arizona, and not just directed at secretaries of state, but removing, nonpartisan independent officials and replacing them with partisan people with a partisan agenda who have said they would be willing to weigh in on the outcome and potentially overturn the will of the voters in doing so. And so what we've seen in Arizona is bills that impact the election procedures manual, which my office is tasked with revising and updating every odd year. And I meant to, I'll circle back to that in a second. And then also, as Alex talked about, the bill that was passed last year in the budget but was struck down by the Supreme Court, not because this provision was unconstitutional, but the way that they budgeted was not valid, putting non-budget related issues into budget bills. So that would remove my office's authority to defend the state in election related lawsuits. And as you probably have seen, if you paid attention, the Attorney General and I have disagreed vehemently on what's in the best interest of the voters of Arizona when it comes to a lot of these issues. And the Attorney General was successful in getting the legislature to remove him as my legal counsel, and then tried to tie my office's hands by not allowing us to expend dollars for outside counsel and not providing any appropriation to create a general counsel office in our office, a position in our office. So those are the specific attacks we've seen. And I'm a problem solver. That's what being a social worker is about. And we've figured out a way to continue to do the work of our office and fight for the voters of Arizona, despite these continued obstacles that the legislature continues to throw in there. The other thing I want to touch on is Alex mentioned the $11 million or so that was granted to local jurisdictions and the Secretary of State's office to help facilitate the 2020 election. And now there's a prohibition on accepting private funds to do that. Private funds are never plan A for election officials, but the government has continued to underfund elections. And certainly we had increased needs last year or in 2020 that weren't being met. And these grants were a lifesaver and helped, I think, help drive the success and the historic participation that we saw in 2020. Just a quick note on the election procedures manual. We updated it for the first time in 2019. This is a manual that takes statute and translates it into operational direction for counties, and it helps ensure that election laws are applied consistently across the state, so that if you're voting in Cochise County, you have relatively the same experience as if you're voting in Coconino County or otherwise. This manual carries the weight of law. It does not allow the Secretary of State's office to write legislation. It has to be approved by the Attorney General and the governor. And in 2019, we had a very collaborative process where we negotiated with the Attorney General's office on changes in the manual and eventually got approval. It was a huge success for us, for counties who hadn't had an updated manual for 5 years. And in 2021, the Attorney General flat out refused to even negotiate with us on anything and demanded wholesale changes that were absolutely unworkable. And so as a consequence, we're still operating under the 2019 manual because there's not an approved updated manual, which is really unfortunate. Another way that these partisan officials are trying to tie our hands in election administration.
Joel and Alex, I want to kind of pivot a little bit to election workers and the defense, the criminalizing of, simple mistakes that an election worker may make, et cetera. But before you do that, I want to kind of frame that context for us as a league involvement. The league is very actively involved in preparing deputy registrars, which is one of the programs that the Maricopa County has to help register voters. And we have worked closely with the county recorders on, preparing our league members to participate. Another area in which we have been active is to actually encourage league members to become poll workers. So now the worry is that, our league members are putting themselves on the line, and, what might we all be thinking about, all of us, in terms of ensuring that we don't frighten off really great poll workers, and we need to have balanced poll workers at every polling location, and that we are working towards, ensuring that they are safe and they're not criminalized. So can we talk about that a little bit? Secretary Hobbs, would you like to kind of weigh in on that first?
I'll let one of the others go first.
Okay. All right, Joel, I saw you unmute yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it brings to mind there's I don't even remember the bill number here, but that's in the spirit of things. There's a bill filed that says if somehow a poll worker accidentally misplaces a ballot and it doesn't end up in the right place at the end of election day, that ballot just doesn't count, even if it could still be counted, but also that poll worker they go to prison. And that is the sort of approach that we are seeing in a ton of bills from legislators that view the county elections offices, that view Secretary Hobbs' office, and that view the community members, the volunteers. I mean, folks get paid a little bit to be poll workers, but you're more or less a volunteer who are making these elections go, treating them as the enemy, right? As something to be punished, folks to be locked up or shamed or shunned in some way. And it all feeds back obviously to the big lie, but the long-term implications is going to be to push good people away from being poll workers, away from being county recorders and elections directors and wanting to be in the Secretary of State's office. and leaving more of those positions in the hands of folks who are there, to carry out the conspiracies. So it really is a scary development that we're seeing. And thank you, Penny, for resharing in the chat. I dropped because I realized it may be difficult to figure out who the legislators are in those district numbers I gave. I only listed, and I slipped up and added one of the Dems on accident into this list, Pollock. But I dropped the names of the majority party senators and representatives who are now in the more competitive districts. And again, that's because these issues are extremely partisan, and it's about flipping one Republican or more to being a no is typically how these bills end up being stopped.
I think the only thing I'd add, I think the only thing I'd add, Penny, is just like norms matter. Like the secretary mentioned earlier, like certified election officials. Okay, like there is a thing like a certified election official. There are people who are certified by the federal government to actually do election audits, right? And what these folks are trying to do is to set aside our whole history's worth of setting up an election system that really is based on checks and balances, right? And even though a recorder may run for one political party or another, or a secretary of state, when they exercise their duty, they're doing it in a nonpartisan way. They're doing it in a way that's actually trying to fairly represent the will of the voters. And there are systems in place to like make sure that it happens that way. And what these folks are doing is they're trying to wipe that away and then install their lackeys in all of these positions because, again, not to make this partisan, but the former president of the United States said recently, it doesn't matter how the people vote as long as we know who counts the votes, as long as we're in charge of who counts the votes, okay? Like that is the level that we're at in this country. So we need people to stay involved. We need people to be election officials, and we need good people to be election officials and to be the Secretary of State. And we need to, as much as we can, be supportive of what people are doing, and we need people to be, to be voter registrars and to be poll workers and to be, do volunteer election protection, because it's the way we're going to protect our democracy. These people are a small minority, but they're loud and they are heavily funded by corporate interests who are actually who would benefit financially from our democracy being harmed. And we need to use the power of the people, because we have the power of the people to push back. But it means we can't just sit there on our phones. We've got to actually get out and take action.
Alex and Joel, thank you. We're going to take one last question. And Secretary Hobbs, thank you so much for staying. You've been more generous in your time than we really have a right to ask at this time. This last question might have I think requires your sort of giving us some thoughts, and then Alex and Joel, if you could weigh in on that. Gittel, if you could ask the question, please. It's an important one. Gittel?
Yes, hi. Yes, I'm absolutely getting there. The question is, will there be federal backup for 2022 elections in the event the state Republicans pull more shenanigans at the polls?
So this is only a partial answer to that, but the Justice Department of the federal government does typically have observers on the ground here in Arizona for our general elections. They're usually here with a specific focus. So a couple elections ago, there had been a lot of reports about the voting machines that a lot of voters with disabilities will use to vote not being set up or turned on correctly. And so they were out here this last election watching out for that. In particular, I would imagine, I don't know if you have, Alex, I haven't heard anything yet specifically about DOJ being out here, but they tend to be each election because we have a variety of systemic issues. So I imagine there will be some kind of backup in that form, as you say, but there tend to just be a handful of those folks. We will be collaborating together, and I'm sure with the league and other organizations around an election protection program that includes both folks who can be at the polls to help voters with issues voting if they're turned away, if they have questions, but also trained de-escalators so that if we do have folks who are showing up trying to intimidate voters, scare them away from the polls, that we can respond to those situations. We did in 2020 and want to build out that capacity. So we're not counting on the feds to solve all of those problems, but I do expect there'll be at least some DOJ presence here.
And I think I would just add that we're as part of our like planning for 2022, we're trying to think through also what happens if people aren't in good faith executing on the election after the fact. And we're just trying to be prepared for that. So, normally all of the folks that do election related stuff, like, a few days after the election, they're all planning on going off somewhere because like it was just getting through the election. I think we all realize now elections don't end on election day. They never did for election officials. And now for election advocates, they're not going to, the election's not going to end on election day. And we're actually planning to have a whole like second wave of volunteers that are available after the election if we need to mobilize people after the election to basically advocate in the post-election world about how the votes are being counted and how the election is being canvassed and certified. And we're prepared to, as community advocates, make sure that the community is engaged in that process because we probably are going to need to be.
I want to end with Secretary Hobbs having the last word in the famous phrase that we often hear on TV. Secretary Hobbs, give us your last word and something to keep our hope going and keep our activism going.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm so sorry, I'm having connectivity issues, so sorry about that. I am, first of all, again, whatever. Anyway, I am so grateful again for all of your work and the fact that despite all of these obstacles and barriers in front of us, making it harder to make our voices heard, that you're continuing to persevere. It is just because they're trying to make it harder, not only to vote, but to even express our views about these terrible bills that will make it harder to vote. It doesn't mean that we should just give up. We can't give up. There's too much at stake here. And I think the multiple attacks we're seeing on our democracy, the criminalization of election officials, the undermining of voters' confidence, the sham, the election subversion activities like these sham audits, these are all on the ballot in 2022 because we're seeing the folks that are engaged in promoting the big lie running for key offices, not just secretaries of state, governors, attorneys general, legislators who make the election laws. And I don't mean to overstate it, but the future of elections, the future of free and fair elections in Arizona and our country are on the ballot in 2022. And the outcome of a lot of these races depend on who's elected. And if we're electing people who are going to continue to ensure the integrity of our elections and work to uphold the will of the voters, are people who will actively engage to undermine it. And so I have faith in that we are going to persevere and prevail in killing a lot of this bad legislation that can directly impact the outcome of the 2022 elections, and that we're going to continue to inform voters what's at stake and make sure that they can have their voices heard in the 2022 elections so that we can preserve fair and free elections in the future. And so thank you so much for the work that all of you are doing on that. I am so grateful.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Joel. And thank you, Secretary Hobbs, for giving us much more than the time we had asked. We so appreciate your joining this conversation. League members and guests, thank you so much. We've lost a couple of folks because we said it was, it's lunchtime and people are done with lunch, So please join us again. We plan on continuing these conversations. A couple of to-do actions for League members and others. One, pay attention to the newsletters. You still got a RTS. Two, contact the legislators on the committees. You've still got to do that. That's your homework assignments, okay? So when you get a newsletter from us, we are serious. We've got to, even though there's the swirl of song, we've got to keep at it. Just say no, as the old phrase it, say no to these bad bills. 3, we need poll workers. I cannot urge you enough to take that into consideration. I'm a poll worker and I love doing that work. I know Alex and Joel are saying, oh my God, okay. But it is important. We need people to be poll workers. We need people to help us in election protection. And you'll hear more about that once I have a conversation with Alex and Joel as to how the league would be participating in that. And we need all the support we can get to have the voters pass the Fair Elections initiative. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us. This is the last of our legislative week. Thank you, Secretary Hobbs, Joel, and Alex for being in this space with us. Bye, everybody.
Thank you all.